Hi, everybody. My name is Ed Simon, and I am a staff writer for a website called The Millions, which the New York Times calls the indispensable literary site. And I'm also a widely published freelance writer with credits and bylines at several different sites, dozens of sites, including The Atlantic, the Paris Review, McSweeney's, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. I'm the author of several different books. But I'm also a born and raised Pittsburgher. So lived in the city when I was growing up, went to all 12 years of public school in the Pittsburgh Public School District, and am a very committed partisan of the city of Pittsburgh and of Western Pennsylvania more generally. Because I am from Pittsburgh and because I'm a writer, it has long been a dream of mine to write about the city of my birth. And so I am the author of this latest book, which is called An Alternative History of Pittsburgh. And Brandon Taper of Whitehall Public Library was generous enough to invite me to come and speak to everybody here and maybe do a reading from my book. And I'm very honored and glad to be appearing before you guys asynchronously, I suppose, but to talk a little bit about what went into the writing of this book, talk about the structure of the book, and talk a little bit about what I discovered about the kind of deep history of Pittsburgh. So, An Alternative History of Pittsburgh was published by a press called Belt Publications, Belt Publishing, and they are headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio, though I do not hold that against them, of course. And what Belt does is they focus on books that kind of ask people to think about the region of the Rust Belt as broadly defined, so Pennsylvania kind of through Minnesota, in a way that kind of questions traditional narratives or maybe stereotypical representations that you see in the national media. So they started as a magazine about 15 years ago now, I believe, called Belt Magazine, which is still published online, and kind of positioned itself as like a New Yorker for the Rust Belt. They've been very successful, and they broke into publishing actual print books several years ago. And I was fortunate enough to work with them over the past 2 years in writing, editing, and releasing this book, which came out on April 20th of this year. So to talk a little bit about the book itself, one of the things that I should emphasize is it's not an exhaustive history. It's not a history of every imaginable thing that you could possibly think about in terms of the city of Pittsburgh. It's a relatively narrow book, all things considered. And what it really is kind of an impressionistic or kaleidoscopic account of things that I thought were particularly interesting about Pittsburgh. Some of them are things that were personally significant to me. Some of them are kind of the historical events that you would expect any history of Pittsburgh to have within it. So Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick and the Battle of Homestead and all of that sort of good stuff is represented in this book. But I like to think of it as kind of a wonder cabinet. And a wonder cabinet is something that was very popular in sort of the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a type of a museum display, and this is metaphorically what I'm comparing my book towards. But a wonder cabinet would be kind of a collection of interesting things, artifacts and minerals and shells and things like that. So I think of An Alternative History of Pittsburgh as kind of my wonder cabinet of Pittsburgh. It's a collection of interesting things that I have found and organized. So in terms of what the structure of the book is like, because this is something where it might differ from a more traditional history or a more scholarly or academic history, is I have 40 chapters that are all relatively short. They're all around, give or take, 1,000 words. And each one of them focuses on a particular narrative or anecdote or event or personality who's significant in some way to Pittsburgh history. And all of these narratives are organized chronologically. From the earliest, which begins 300 million years ago with the Pennsylvanian era, that is the era in which most of the coal deposits that made the city fabulously wealthy, of course, much, much later, when they were first deposited, the sort of geographic reasons why Pittsburgh is the way that it is, going all the way up to our present day. And each one of the narratives can sort of move backwards and forwards in history. They all begin at kind of a definite date that is chronologically organized, but they branch out in all kinds of different sorts of ways. And the reason I did this way is I drew the structure of my book from a writer named Eduardo Galeano. He was a Uruguayan writer, and he wrote Histories of Latin America. And he did the same sort of structure. We'd have these little vignettes, these like short little kind of almost like flash nonfiction that would kind of give you this sort of picture here and there of what an area was like, and then taken all together, there's an attempt to kind of convey what the spirit of a place is, maybe in a way that's a little bit different from if this was, an academic work of history where I was in the archive and I was trying to present an authoritative, exhaustive overview of the region itself. So the way in which those are the 40 short chapters I have, plus an introduction and an afterword. In each one of the sections are part of a larger section overall. So there are 3 broad breakdowns in the book that kind of correspond to particular historical time periods. So each one of these parts, these three parts, draws its title from a poem by a great Pittsburgh poet named Jack Gilbert. And Jack Gilbert lived in East Liberty. He moved out of the city, I think, when he was in his early 20s. He did briefly attend Pitt. And in 1960, I want to say, he won a very prestigious poetry award called the Yale Younger Poets Award. And this is something that's given every year to somebody who is supposed to be kind of a sterling example of a young poet. And Jack Gilbert sort of had fame very early on in his life, and then he kind of he didn't dwindle away. He always worked, but he was not particularly prolific, and he kind of lived by the beat of his own drum, as it were. So he periodically gets rediscovered, and then he kind of disappears again. He never lived in Pittsburgh in his adulthood. So he lived in Japan, he lived in Greece, he lived in New York, he lived in San Francisco. But he returned to Pittsburgh all of the time. And so the epigraph to my book, and I can actually read the epigraph to you guys, is from a poem called Searching for Pittsburgh. And I'm going to read this to you now just because each one of the parts of my own book draws its title and kind of its thematic concerns from this poem. So Gilbert writes, "Mass of water flowing morning and night throughout a city girded with 90 bridges. Sumptuous-shouldered, sleek-thighed, obstinate and majestic, unquenchable. All grip and flood, mighty sucking in deep-rooted grace. A city of brick and tired wood, ox and sovereign spirit. Primitive Pittsburgh. Winter month after month telling of death. The beauty forcing us as much as harshness. Our spirits forged in that wilderness, our minds forged by the heart, making together a consequence of America." And so each one of the parts of my book draws its title from one of the lines there. So the very first part is entitled Ox and Sovereign Spirit, and that is land, people, and beginnings from 300 million BCE up to 1799. So that first part of that book, I've got several short chapters, deal entirely with the kind of like early history of the city. I begin with that kind of very early, prehistoric, 300 million years ago chapter. But then the bulk of that chapter really focuses on the 18th century. So it talks a lot about the French and Indian War, the kind of foundation of Fort Pitt, those sorts of things. Part 2 is entitled City of Brick and Tired Wood, Industry, Labor, and Growth, and that is 1800 to 1899. And that particular section focuses on really when Pittsburgh became the Pittsburgh we know today, when industry and labor kind of didn't always work together, sometimes antagonistically worked with one another, very kind of combative and explosive time period, as you'll learn. But it's really when Pittsburgh became important, when it became kind of the center of industry that we think of it, or that it once was. And then part 3 is entitled A Consequence of America, Rise, Fall, and Reinvention. And that's 1900 to today. So a focus on kind of Pittsburgh's triumphs in the 20th century, the decline of big steel, and then sort of a meditation on where Pittsburgh might be going in the future. So what I'd like to do is each one of the chapters, the whole book itself, is obviously not something that I can read to you right now. But to give you a sense of the scope of the book, what I'd like to do is read one chapter from each one of those parts. So read you one of the early chapters, read you one of the middle ones, and read you one of the ones from the last section. The very first chapter that I would like to read for you is entitled The Ill-Fated Vandalia Colony. And this chapter begins in the year 1769. Pittsburgh was the first metropolis of the Appalachian frontier. So much of American regional identity was shaped by historical events in the subsequent century, but divisions between North and South, East and West, were not intrinsic, born rather from arbitrary distinctions that could shift. Pittsburgh was a relative latecomer in the history of early American colonization. Maybe it would be more accurate to say that Pittsburgh is among the oldest new places, the first of the westward settlements that would eventually stretch to the Pacific. More than a century separates Fort Pitt from Jamestown, New Amsterdam, and Boston. Even Philadelphia is almost 100 years older. As Fort Pitt transformed into Pittsburgh, her reputation as the gateway to the West was earned in economic importance and ambiguous geography as well. Such is the uncertainty of the frontier. It rejects the certainty of the border in favor of an ever-shifting and expanding field. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner, in his classic 1893 essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, claimed that this was a country defined by coarseness and strength combined with acuteness and inquisitiveness, the domain of a restless nervous energy, that dominant individualism working for good and evil, and exuberance which comes from freedom. No contemporary American metropolis exists at the confluence of three major geographic regions. Technically in the Northeast, often thought of as Midwestern, and only a few clicks above the Mason-Dixon line. Northeast, Midwest, and the South are all arbitrary constructions, having little to do with hill and mountain, stream and river. What would be more accurate is to understand that Pittsburgh was, and always has been, Appalachian. In the late 18th century, no settlement of English speakers had a higher population in the Appalachians, and that remains true. Pittsburgh radically differed from Puritan Boston, Dutch Reformed New York, Quaker Philadelphia, and Anglican Jamestown. Those whom initially settled Pittsburgh were from the northern English Midlands, the Scottish Lowlands, and Ulster. Here the English, Scots, and Scots-Irish found a terrain that in hill and green dale reminded them of those places from which they had come, and they exported with them their low church Presbyterian faith. Calvinist Presbyterianism marked western Pennsylvania, as sure as the traditionalist Anglicans of the South, the radical Quakers of the East, or the staid Puritans of the North affected their respective regions. For the inheritors of Penn's utopian vision in Philadelphia, the battle-hardened Scots and Scots-Irish provided a convenient means of fighting the Indians and French, Presbyterianism having no pacifist inclinations in need of sublimation. Historian David Hackett Fisher in Albion Seed, Four British Folkways in America, argues that regional identity indelibly marked the English, Scottish, and Irish settlers to their respective areas. Just as New England's character was supposedly shaped by Yankee values of thrift and simplicity, or the South's was affected by the Cavalier ethos of tradition and leisure, so Fisher claims that Scottish Presbyterianism gave the Appalachians, on either side of the Mason-Dixon line, their own distinct identity. Fisher writes of these immigrants that the speech of these people was English, but they spoke with a lilting cadence that rang strangely in the ear. Many were desperately poor, but even in their poverty they carried themselves with a fierce and stubborn pride that wanted others to treat them with respect. No doubt, that description is one that many contemporary Pittsburghers would be attracted to, even as most of our ancestors aren't from Manchester, Glasgow, or Ulster, but rather Dublin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Naples, Warsaw, Krakow, Budapest, and Prague, not to mention from Richmond, Charleston, and Montgomery. Despite Fisher's merits, it's important not to overly reduce and essentialize. After all, inhabitants of Boston and Philadelphia probably see themselves as having a fierce and stubborn pride as well. Nevertheless, there's a merit to understanding that Pittsburgh isn't Plymouth. As concerns its home province, Pittsburgh has always been more in Pennsylvania than it has been of Pennsylvania. In 1769, surveyors in the Grand Ohio Company proposed a new colony to be named in honor of the German-born British Queen, Vandalia. This new territory was to include almost all of present-day West Virginia, large portions of Kentucky, and western Pennsylvania south of the Ohio River, with a capital at Fort Pitt. Less than a decade later, and inspired by the ideals of the Revolution in 1776, the yeoman farmers of Allegheny proposed a new state called Westlvania, a sister colony in the 14th province of the American Confederacy. So said the said country be constituted and declared, and acknowledged a separate, distinct, and independent province and government. That Vandalia failed, that it isn't real, underscores the contingencies of geography. That Westlvania was never recognized should be no impediment to acknowledging its existence. Okay, next chapter I'd like to read. It's in part 2. We're going to jump more than 100 years into the future. So, the Great Railroad Strike, 1877. When the Pennsylvania Railroad and Union Depot, situated in the Strip District, caught fire in 1877, there wasn't doubt as to its cause. Torched by railroad workers themselves, the station was immolated as one of the more spectacular events in the violent strikes that stretched from Baltimore to Pittsburgh, from West Virginia to New York, and that would be remembered by enraged and fearful robber barons as the years that communism gained a toehold in the industrial heartland of the United States. The Great Railroad Strike didn't begin in Pittsburgh, and it wasn't contained to Pittsburgh. Labor solidarity stretched from Reading and Shamokin to Scranton and Albany, as well as Syracuse and Buffalo. But Pittsburgh was where workers would fight the hardest and where state brutality would be the most marked. For 45 days, the strikers brought commerce to a halt as the nation seemed on the verge of a full-blown socialist revolution. For a brief period, the city was in the grip of the workers, an American incarnation of the Paris Commune established by anarchists, socialists, and communists for a few brief months in 1871, or at least both detractors and supporters made that comparison. Writing with purple pen a few months after the strike ended, the St. Louis Dispatch journalist J.A. Dacus opined in, and it's a long title, Annals of the Great Strikes in the United States, a reliable history and graphic description of the causes and thrilling events of the labor strikes and riots of 1877, that, quote, men remembered France and the scenes of 1789 to 93 and trembled as they heard the tumult increase and saw the mighty masses of strange, grimy men, excited by passions dark and fearful, surging along the streets. The upheaval started in Martinsburg, West Virginia, appropriately enough on Bastille Day. Only a few months before, the federal government betrayed the promise of Reconstruction throughout the demilitarized South. Reconstruction had enacted a radical program of racial and economic justice that went far beyond the program debated at the Pittsburgh Conference in 1856. West Virginians had first rejected the slave system of their state government in Richmond, and in 1877 they rejected the system of wage slavery that increasingly dominated the economics of the Gilded Age North. A connection between the Compromise of 77 and the federal government's violent reaction to the railroad strikes is not incidental. Noted by David O. Stonewell in Streets, Railroads, and the Great Strike of 1877, quote, with Reconstruction at an end, a new era of increasing conflict between labor and capital commenced. Weeks before federal troops had been patrolling southern states. Now, with some irony, Stonewall notes that those same soldiers massed in northern cities to help suppress rioting free white laborers and other urban residents. President Rutherford B. Hayes was instrumental in both Reconstruction's demise and the government's reaction to the strike, and as such, he was representative of the reaction against a more emancipatory politics. Such revanchism encouraged both state-sanctioned terrorism against black Americans in the South, leading to the Great Migration northward, which demographically altered cities like Pittsburgh, as well as the anti-labor policies formed in response to workers' rights. The strike itself was born from the deprivations of the economic slump that began in 1873, a depression that would last longer than its 20th century counterpart. For workers across the rapidly industrializing nation, the depression was disastrous, with the moneyed class compensating by slashing employee pay, increasing work hours, and refusing to acknowledge any labor organizations. Keeping score is easy if you're being honest, for as Pittsburgh's National Labor Tribune noted, these men merely want to live, and do not want their wives and little ones to starve, which they must certainly do if they are compelled to accept the terms of the company and go to work. A fully radicalized city government refused to enforce the dictates of either the Pennsylvania Railroad or the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So for the second time in Pittsburgh's history, Western Pennsylvania was marched on by Eastern troops, as Philadelphia's National Guard were sent to enforce capital's property rights. One journalist castigated this insane policy of calling Philadelphia troops to quell domestic quarrel as something that was reprehensible beyond degree. And if Pittsburgh troops were unwilling to open fire on their neighbors, the Eastern interlopers were not so placid. One robber baron gleefully said that the strikers should be fed a rifle diet for a few days, and see how they like that kind of bread. So it would be, for on July 21st, those troops would kill more than 4 dozen Pittsburghers. In response, the strikers would burn not just the depot, but dozens of buildings, hundreds of engines, passenger and railroad cars, and thousands of freight cars owned by the railroad company while pushing the National Guard out of the city where they hid atop the northern hills across the Allegheny River. The Pittsburgh Sunday Globe Extra referred to the bloodshed as the Lexington of the labor conflict. The harmonists north of the city wondered whether this reign of terror marked the beginning of the harvest time spoken of in Scripture, while a Pittsburgh newspaper sympathetic to labor thought it the beginning of a revolution, which will in the future history of this country be designated as the beginning of the Second American Revolution, which inaugurated the independence of labor from capital. As it was, the events of 1877 were neither apocalypse nor revolution, but rather a faint shadow from a parallel universe where the United States could have been a genuine socialist country. As with the Paris Commune, the rioters were agitating not just for fair working conditions, but for the profits of their own labor. Order would be restored when federal troops were activated and sent into Pittsburgh by President Hayes, drawing the experiment to a close. Pittsburgh and the riots neither surprised nor disturbed me, wrote novelist Mark Twain, for when the government is a sham, one must expect such things. If American industry, with all of its totalizing enormity and might, was born at the Three Rivers, then so too was the response of the working man. The lessons of 1877 are radical ones, and so knowledge of the event is often occluded and passed over, but the impromptu strike and its solidarity were a powerful spark. Labor historian Philip Foner says as much in the Great Labor Uprising of 1877, writing that it was a social rebellion, the first assertion by a national working class of a common anger against a variety of grievances, years of brutal exploitation and a system of industrialization which viewed the worker as little more than part of the machine. It was the first real evidence of working class collective power. An editorial in a local newspaper was more succinct, if no less astute. Pittsburgh had taught the monopolists a lesson they will never forget. So, the final chapter we're reading for you today begins in 1938, and it is entitled Billy Strayhorn Meets Duke Ellington. When the prodigy Billy Strayhorn first met Duke Ellington on a December evening in 1938, introduced to the band leader in the latter's dressing room backstage at the Stanley Theater, he was only 23. 15 years the junior of Ellington, who was already dubbed the King of Jazz by the national black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, Strayhorn was a slight, skinny, bookish, effeminate man who paid his bills by working at a Point Breeze pharmacy as a soda jerk. A circuitous work connection is what allowed Strayhorn to meet Ellington, who was used to the admiration of young fans. Strayhorn already had a reputation as a talent in Pittsburgh's jazz scene, having written a sophisticated classical composition that was played at his graduation from Westinghouse High School 5 years before. He'd since gone on to compose and arrange for a local jazz ensemble with the name of the Mad Hatters. Now in downtown Pittsburgh, only a few miles from clubs like the Sawdust Trail and the Crawford Grill, sponsor of the Negro League baseball team that bore their name, that lined Wiley and Center Avenues in the Hill, and which earned that neighborhood the sobriquet, the crossroads of the world, by the Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay. Strayhorn would formally meet the most famous American composer there. Strayhorn confidently sat at the piano, and with perfect verisimilitude was able to imitate Ellington's songs like In a Sentimental Mood and Caravan, and to then demonstrate the ways in which their arrangements could be improved. Then the 23-year-old soda jerk performed some of his own compositions. Ellington, immediately recognizing Strayhorn's genius, and true to the democratic ethos of jazz itself, invited the younger man to New York so they could collaborate. Strayhorn jotted down Ellington's directions uptown, with the line "Take the A Train" becoming the title of his most famous song and the theme of the orchestra itself. The two would forge the most productive creative partnership of the 20th century. Strayhorn would compose and arrange standards for Ellington's orchestra, including Satin Doll and Lush Life. Despite Strayhorn's relative anonymity, Ellington always acknowledged the talent and genius of these contributions. David Hajdu writes in Lush Life, a biography of Billy Strayhorn, that the musician, who wrote hit songs, jazz pieces, concert works, film scores, music for Broadway shows, was often viewed as Ellington's alter ego, who wrote in a style so akin to Ellington's that few people could distinguish their work. Debates have long raged between those who view Strayhorn as fundamentally a rustic who was tutored by Ellington, and those who see him as the musical power behind the throne. Promulgated for years, Hajdu writes, of both sides, and none of this turned out to be so simple. As an arranger, Strayhorn was unparalleled, and Ellington would declare that he was my right arm, my left arm, all the eyes in the back of my head, my brain waves in his head, and his in mine. To reduce either man's contributions is to fundamentally misunderstand jazz and the nature of collaboration, what critic Ted Gioia describes in The History of Jazz as being the case where Strayhorn became a true partner, playing a pivotal role in shaping the band's sound. Strayhorn was urbane, elegant, sophisticated, and openly homosexual. The lyricist who in Lush Life could write that, "I used to visit all the very gay places, those come what may places, where one relaxes on the axis of the wheel of life to get the feel of life from jazz and cocktails." Though classical music was his first love, it was an impossibility that a black man of his generation could build a career in that elitist realm. But he brought a symphonic sensibility to his collaborations, including Ellington's Black, Brown, and Beige, which premiered in 1943 at New York's Carnegie Hall. Despite a cosmopolitan life in New York and Paris, it was the black community in Pittsburgh that birthed Strayhorn, the homewood where he was educated, once answering that all of his genius was learned in high school, and the Hill District, where he first became conversant with jazz. When Pittsburgh's neighborhoods were filling with immigrants from places like Vilnius, Krakow, and Naples, there were also thousands of black Americans arriving from the areas around Birmingham, Atlanta, and Greensboro. Strayhorn's maternal family was from North Carolina, for example. As part of the Great Migration, the single largest internal movement in American history. Journalist Mark Whitaker notes in Smoketown, the untold story of the other great black Renaissance, that the communities migrants built in the Hill District was for a brief but glorious stretch of the 20th century one of the most vibrant and consequential communities of color in U.S. history. Central to black life in Pittsburgh was jazz, and as the city was almost equidistant from New York and Chicago, it became a regular part of the circuit of musicians who performed in its clubs night after night. The Hills clubs were not just a stage for visiting musicians, but for the city's own performers, with Whitaker celebrating this black version of the story of 15th century Florence and early 20th century Vienna, a miraculous flowering of social and cultural achievement all at once in one small city. Over the next few decades, Hill District clubs would be the university for a cadre of Pittsburgh jazz performers, including not just Strayhorn, but singer Billy Eckstine, pianist Errol Garner, pianist Mary Lou Williams, drummer Art Blakey, trumpeter Roy Eldridge, pianist Ahmed Jamal, drummer Kenny Clark, bassist Paul Chambers, bassist Ray Brown, and the great platonic love of Strayhorn's life, the singer and actress Lena Horne, who claimed that had the composer not been gay, she would have surely married him. What resulted was America's greatest cultural contribution, our own indigenous music. In the canonized realm of those who contributed to that mission, Strayhorn is an invaluable member of the pantheon. Conventional wisdom has configured Strayhorn as dwelling in Ellington's shadow, but that's an incomplete understanding of his significance. The two were halves of a greater talent. They were twinned aspects of the same personality, the same inspiration, the same genius. And the songs, the melancholic pining of lush life, the sultry eroticism of Satin Doll, the sheer, joyful expression of Take the A Train, a composition that said so much about American modernity. I'll live a lush life in some small dive, wrote Strayhorn, and there I'll be while I rot with the rest of those whose lives are lonely too. It was esophageal cancer that would take him in 1967, exacerbated by years of alcoholism, the only thing that he'd inherited from his father. 2 years later, and Ellington would release an album in his partner's honor entitled And His Mother Called Him Bill. The last track was recorded by accident, Ellington performing Strayhorn's composition Lotus Blossom unaccompanied on piano, while the rest of the band members packed up their instruments and left the studio. All right, well, thank all of you so much for spending some time listening to me. I hope that you enjoyed those chapters. I hope you take an opportunity to read the book in its entirety. It's definitely something that I think you can kind of dip in and out of and read on your own accord, but also something that if you read it cover to cover, I think hopefully will illuminate certain things about Pittsburgh as well. So pick up a copy of the book, and please follow the rest of my writing. I have a couple other books that are actually coming out in the next few months. So pandemic year has been a busy year for me. The most forthcoming will be one that's coming out on June 8th from Broadleaf Books entitled The God Beat, What Journalism Says About Faith and Why It Matters. It's an anthology of writings by other journalists who focus on religion primarily. It was co-edited by me and a professor of philosophy at Texas State University named Costa Cabradyton. And I'd also ask you to please follow me on Twitter if that is your thing. My Twitter handle is @WithEdSimon. So that's just with Ed Simon after the ampersand @ and you can also follow me on my website, which is edsimon.org. In addition, I'm always happy to hear from people, so if you have any questions or you want any follow-up or illumination on anything or just want to reach out and get in touch, please feel free to do so. My email address is edsimon310, that's EDSIMON, all lowercase, 310, @gmail.com. So again, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Brandon for inviting me. It's really been an honor, and I hope that I get to hear from some of you in the future. Thank you so much.